The first YoKai Watch game came out in Japan in 2013, and it took Japan by storm. It exploded in popularity, sold very well in Japan, and spawned many sequels, spin-off games, a manga, and an anime series. YoKai Watch is a franchise mostly targeted towards younger kids, where a boy named Nate befriends mythical Japanese creatures called yokai and has many different adventures with them throughout the various regions he explores. This kid's genre of anime is a rather difficult market to get into, as most franchises with a similar concept and a similar target audience spawned in the late 90s and early 2000s, with not much really coming out since then. YoKai Watch broke that mold and was so popular in Japan in 2014 and 2015 that they ended up expanding worldwide. YoKai Watch 1 finally released in the US in the fall of 2015 for the 3DS, and for the rest of the world shortly after in early 2016. The manga got translated to English, and the anime even found its way onto Disney XD in the United States, which it still airs to this day. YoKai Watch was off to a pretty decent start outside of Japan, but unfortunately, once YoKai Watch left Japan and expanded worldwide, this also marked the decline of YoKai Watch. Now before we get too far into this video, I want to preface by saying this video is not just me hating or bashing on YoKai Watch in any way. I'm sure there might be people out there who just look at the title and leave a hateful comment without actually understanding what this video is about. I am a fan of the series, played all the main games up until now and that were released in English, seen some of the anime, and think it's overall a pretty good franchise. There's no denying that YoKai Watch never reached the same popularity in the rest of the world like it did in Japan, and that it's been declining in Japan ever since 2016 or so. In this video, we'll discuss the history of YoKai Watch, how it rose to power, and what led to the decline of YoKai Watch, as well as the global expansion that it had. 2014 might as well have been the year of the yokai in Japan. This was the year that YoKai Watch completely exploded and even rivaled Pokemon in terms of popularity. I remember reading articles around this time about how in Japanese malls, kids would line up to take pictures with YoKai Watch mascots such as Jibanyan, while most kids ignored Pikachu and other Pokemon mascots in order to wait in line just for an opportunity to have a picture with Jibanyan. This was around the time that I first heard of YoKai Watch, and it was hyped up to be the next big thing, which is pretty exciting. I think part of the reason why YoKai Watch was so popular in Japan was because yokai are actually part of Japanese folklore. Stories of these yokai have been told for generations in Japan, making the characters more recognizable to kids as opposed to having a brand new creature or a brand new IP that people aren't exactly familiar with. The best thing I can think to compare this to is a game like Smite, which uses well-known mythical characters like Zeus or Anubis as opposed to making brand new characters in order to be more familiar to a standard user. YoKai Watch bases their yokai in their games off of actual Japanese yokai, but with an exaggerated and often cute twist to make them more kid-friendly. For example, we have Wall Kappa, a cute aquatic yokai based off the Japanese yokai Kappa. There are similarities between the two, however the actual Kappa is known for attacking humans and being rather violent, which of course was toned down for YoKai Watch. I think it's also a nice touch that Wall Kappa in YoKai Watch ends up liking cucumbers, just like how Kappas in Japanese folklore like cucumbers, which is a nice little touch to make it relate to yokai even more. Now this method was fantastic for familiarizing the general Japanese audience with the concept of YoKai Watch, which only helped increase its popularity. The first game sold over 1 million copies in Japan alone, which is rather impressive for the first game in a brand new franchise, with all the competition that it has, especially in a country like Japan that doesn't have the same population as something like the US or Europe. The YoKai Watch craze continued until after the release of YoKai Watch 2, which was the best-selling YoKai Watch game in Japan, selling about 3 million units. This was around 2014-2015, and this was the height of the YoKai Watch craze in Japan. People genuinely believed that YoKai Watch had what it took to overcome Pokemon in terms of popularity and be the next big thing, which is why they decided to expand outside of Japan and bring YoKai Watch to a global audience. And to be honest, it really wasn't too unrealistic to think that YoKai Watch could be the next big thing. YoKai Watch 1 finally released outside of Japan in late 2015 and early 2016 depending on where you live, and the build up to the international release had many people interested, myself included. YoKai Watch was a dominant force in Japan, and truly had the potential to be the next worldwide phenomenon. I remember reading articles and watching videos about people talking about how great YoKai Watch was in Japan, and how once the demo was released for the 3DS, I downloaded it as quickly as I could, and from the start, I could see the appeal of the YoKai Watch franchise. To put it simply, the games are just fun. It feels familiar to other games while having some different elements make it feel a little bit more unique, so of course when the game finally released in a physical form, I bought it on the day of release and started making videos on the game, and they ended up doing rather well for my channel, which led me to believe that YoKai Watch really did have potential to be the next big thing, and YoKai Watch was actually off to a fairly decent start outside of Japan, which is a great sign for the franchise. The game actually ended up selling less copies in the US than Japan, however, but considering it was a brand new franchise, selling about 500,000 copies in 6 months in the US isn't too bad, especially when the US doesn't have that same yokai relation as Japan does. With the news of YoKai Watch 2 being localized in the fall of 2016, and seeing how YoKai Watch 2 was the best-selling YoKai Watch game in Japan that came out at the height of its popularity, it was possible that YoKai Watch 2 releasing worldwide could have a similar effect on the franchise in the rest of the world, and strengthen the franchise worldwide. Now, in the time between the first YoKai Watch game release in the US and the second YoKai Watch game release, the anime started airing on Disney XD in the US, and some other YoKai Watch merchandise was released. The anime is widely regarded to be a pretty decent anime for a kids-focused anime, and I have to say I do agree with this. I've seen it a few times myself, and it made me laugh a couple of times. However, the ratings are still relatively low, especially from what they were in Japan. Now, this can be attributed to the fact that the anime is being aired on Disney's sister channel, which isn't as common as the main Disney channel or any other main channels. The anime probably would have received better ratings if it was on a network like Cartoon Network or the main Nickelodeon channel at the time, but unfortunately being on a less common network will result in lower ratings, despite how good the show might be. One advantage similar anime had in the early 2000s over the YoKai Watch anime was that they aired on channels that pretty much everybody with a television had access to, despite what provider they had, with most of these similar kids anime being on Fox or Kids WB. That era of television is behind us, unfortunately, which also made it a little bit more difficult for YoKai Watch to explode in the West. Some YoKai Watch toys were produced by Hasbro as well, which I remember seeing at Target around the time of the release in late 2015 and early 2016. Apparently in the middle of 2017, Hasbro decided to stop distributing YoKai Watch toys in the US and a few other countries, which really isn't a great sign. About a year ago or so, when Toys R Us was liquidating all their stores, I went to my local Toys R Us just a day before they officially closed, just out of curiosity to see what they have and to relive some nostalgia. The majority of the store was closed off since they didn't really have much inventory left, and I remember seeing a couple of bins just filled with mostly YoKai Watch toys and a few other random toys here and there. This again isn't exactly a good sign to see, as all of these toys were on clearance, with all of them being at least 50% off, and even at those low prices, the YoKai Watch toys just weren't selling. Now, despite some of these red flags, YoKai Watch 2 still released outside of Japan, and they decided to stick with how they handled the Japanese release, with having two different versions for YoKai Watch 2 in YoKai Watch 2 Fleshy Souls and YoKai Watch 2 Bony Spirits, similar to what you would see Pokemon do. This worked very well in Japan, and probably helped boost some sales since people were out there probably trying to get both games, and I can see why they would want to try the same thing outside of Japan. Now, I can't find concrete sales numbers for YoKai Watch 2 outside of Japan, but from what I can see online, it seems like they sold relatively poorly in the US, but fairly decent in Europe. The first YoKai Watch game sold a little bit better in Europe than the US as well, and the European sales might be why they decided to release YoKai Watch 2 Psychic Spectres outside of Japan in the fall of 2017, which, to compare it to Pokemon again, is like the Pokemon Emerald or Pokemon Platinum of the YoKai Watch 2 games. Unfortunately, I can't find specific sales numbers for Psychic Spectres either, but we can assume that it was around the same or less than the original YoKai Watch 2 games were. And even though YoKai Watch 2 was released at the height of YoKai Trace in Japan, that wasn't the case outside of the US, as they sold a little bit less than the first game in the series. In my opinion, the second game is also the worst in the franchise, which might have had something to do with it, and is also backed up by the mediocre review scores all around that YoKai Watch 2 received. So now, leading into YoKai Watch 3's release, this is when you really start to see the decline in Japan. 2016 was a down year compared to the previous 2 years in Japan, with YoKai Watch 3 selling about 1.5 million units in Japan. Again, I'm having a hard time finding specific numbers, but this is the number I see thrown around the most. YoKai Watch 3 was separated into two versions as well, just like YoKai Watch 2 was, with YoKai Watch 3 Sushi and YoKai Watch 3 Tempura for the 3DS, but they unfortunately did not do as well as the Titan that was YoKai Watch 2 in Japan. If you compare this to the YoKai Watch spin-off game, YoKai Watch Busters, which released a year prior in Japan, it had 2 versions as well and sold nearly 1 million more units. This game was released in the summer of 2015 towards the end of the yokai craze, but still sold very well, especially considering the fact that it is just a spin-off title. This was the beginning of the end. However, despite YoKai Watch 3's decline in Japan, they still decided to release YoKai Watch 3 worldwide. YoKai Watch 3 ended up being released in Europe in December of 2018 and the United States in February of 2019. I'm not really sure why there was such a gap between releases in the West, but I'm going to assume that since the first 2 YoKai Watch games sold better in Europe than in the US, they wanted to release the game in Europe for the holiday season to boost sales a little bit maybe. They also scrapped the 2-version system outside of Japan and just released one version of YoKai Watch 3, simply titled YoKai Watch 3. There's no sales reports for YoKai Watch 3 that I can find at this time, and there aren't very many official reviews out there as well. We can assume that the game sold pretty poorly, however, as many GameStops, including my local GameStop, got very few copies in stock, if any. My local GameStop, in fact, only ended up getting 1 single copy of YoKai Watch 3, and that's only because I pre-ordered the game. If I hadn't pre-ordered the game, the manager told me that they would not have received any copies at all, which of course isn't a good sign. Now, sure, you can just go and buy the game digitally, and buying games digitally has risen in popularity, but not having physical copies of the game in a store like GameStop is not a good sign. I haven't even seen the game in my local Target, which of course is not a good sign. This is very sad to see, especially for me personally, as YoKai Watch 3 is actually a pretty good game, but due to YoKai Watch's decline in Japan and the struggles it's faced outside of Japan, it was kinda doomed from the start. This isn't the end of YoKai Watch though, in fact it is far from it. Despite taking a huge hit in popularity in Japan compared to what it had just a few years ago, the series is still relatively popular and is still going on in Japan. It's not quite that Pokemon killer or that next big craze it had potential to be or it was hyped up to be, but it doesn't have to be that. I'm unsure if we will see any future releases of YoKai Watch games sold outside of Japan, especially when it comes to the spin-off titles, since we've only received one of the 4 spin-off titles outside of Japan, but hey, you never know. The 3DS is also really old and on the very tail end of its lifespan, so releasing 3DS games for a franchise that hasn't done too well in Japan at this late in its life cycle probably isn't the best idea. Maybe we still have hope to get that YoKai Watch and Just Dance crossover game for the Wii U in the West, but I don't know. Aside from spin-off games, YoKai Watch 4 is set to release in June in Japan for the Nintendo Switch. From the trailers, the gameplay, and the screenshots that I've seen of YoKai Watch 4, it actually looks very promising, and YoKai Watch is a game that I think can really take advantage of the Switch's potential with the Joy-Cons. According to series creator Akihiro Hino, he wants to refresh the series with YoKai Watch 4 in order to bring back older players from the first 2 YoKai Watch games. They're aware of the decline YoKai Watch had after the first 2 games, so you really have to respect that they want to return to the former glory and improve upon what worked with the YoKai Watch formula. YoKai Watch 4 looks extremely promising, and seeing how well the Switch is doing, I hope that it can help turn the franchise around, even if it's just a little bit. The unfortunate thing is, seeing as YoKai Watch is on a decline, if YoKai Watch 4 sells poorly in Japan, it is possible that it could mark the end of the series, which would really be a shame. I really hope that YoKai Watch 4 sells well and restores the franchise in Japan. I'm not sure if they can return to their former glory they had in 2014 and 2015, but any improvement compared to what they have now will help the franchise tremendously and increase the possibility of YoKai Watch 4 being released outside of Japan. Since YoKai Watch games had a couple of years of a head start in Japan before being released outside of Japan, we had to wait as much as 2 years for some of these games to be released, but we are finally at a point where we're pretty much caught up with Japan when it comes to releases. This means that if they do decide to release YoKai Watch 4 internationally, we probably won't have to wait too long for it, so I really do hope that the game sells well, so us in the West can get a chance to play it in English. I doubt that we will see YoKai Watch 4 release in the West this year, but hey, maybe in the spring 2020 if we're lucky, or if we're super lucky, maybe for the holiday season this year. I personally think that they should rename the game for the West, however, since people might be intimidated seeing YoKai Watch 4 on the shelves, not having played the first 3 in the franchise, which might deter them from the series. Either way, despite the decline that YoKai Watch had in Japan and its struggles it's had outside of Japan, YoKai Watch isn't quite done yet. There's still some exciting things to come for the franchise, which will hopefully make its way to the West as well. I really do enjoy this series, and in my opinion, the first YoKai Watch game is easily one of my top 5 favorite 3DS games of all time, so I would love to see the series continue and see YoKai Watch 4 in the West. 2019 is a pretty big, important, and exciting year for the YoKai Watch franchise, and I really do hope that some of YoKai Watch's former glory can be restored, but only time will tell.